Thanks for being here today. This is a webinar presented by the Behavioral Economics in Action at Rotman in partnership with the Behaviorally Informed Organizations Partnership. Although we're meeting virtually, we'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. My name is Colin West. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Behavioral Economics in Action group at Rotman, and I'll moderate today's webinar. We're delighted to have Chiara Varazzani, Lead Behavioural Scientist at the OECD. Before I introduce Chiara, I'd just like to go over a couple of the ground rules for the webinar. Following the introduction, Chiara will deliver a 30 to 35-minute presentation. You can submit questions for our speaker using the Q&A tab at the top of your Zoom screen or typing into the box there. At the end of the talk, with time permitting, we'll have a Q&A session in which I can select questions from our Q&A tab and I'll pose the questions to Chiara. So without any further ado, I'll introduce Chiara. Chiara is a lead behavioral scientist at OECD. She's also served as a member of the Technical Advisory Group on Behavioural Insights for the World Health Organization and is an Adjunct Research Fellow at Monash University. Chiara has led units of behavioral scientists in government, designed behavior change interventions, and shaped communications across different policy areas, including health, education, financial decision-making, energy, and international development. Prior to this, Chiara had several positions in government. She was a principal advisor for the Behavioural Insights Unit of the Victorian Government in Australia, an advisor to the behavioral economics to the Australian federal government, and a research fellow at the Behavioural Insights Team in London. She holds a Master's of Science from the School of Advanced Studies in Social Sciences, a Master's in Science in Cognitive Sciences, and a PhD in Behavioural Neuroscience from Sorbonne University. So thank you very much, Chiara, for being here, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Colin, for that nice introduction, and hello, everyone. So let me share my screen straight away. Let me know if you cannot see my slides. One sec. There you go. You should be able to see everything. So thanks again, and thanks also to Dilip, Liz, Cindy, and all the other colleagues at Bear for this invitation. I'm very happy to be here. So with our time together today, I would like to start by giving a very quick recap or a quick introduction on behavioral insights and public policy. And then I would like to tell you about what we're doing at the OECD in the space of behavioral science with some examples. And lastly, I would like to share with you some quick thoughts and wishes for the future of the Behavioral Insights community. So let's start with a definition of behavioral insights. So behavioral insights is an approach that uses evidence of the conscious and non-conscious drivers of human behavior. And this can inform the design of government interventions to improve the welfare of people. So it's great to have definitions, but why is this important, and why policymakers should be concerned by this? Well, when you think about it, many public policy challenges involve human behavior, and starting from child nutrition, so from very early ages down to all your life, but also recently we've seen that the pandemic is very much linked to our behaviors and the spread of COVID-19. And so behavioral change is very important in everything from mask wearing down to COVID-19 vaccination. Even if this is trivial and it seems very obvious to everybody, still policymakers often assume an unrealistic model of human behavior. And really, behavioral insights and behavioral insights experts, what we do is that rather than expecting people to be always optimal decision makers, we try to ensure that policymakers will design policies to really go with the grain of human behavior. And so in a way, BI brings a deep understanding of human behavior, hopefully to design and implement better policies. Now, I'm a big fan of timelines. So here I will give a synopsis, not exhaustive, of course, of how we moved from that book in 2008, Nudge, that was, several years ago, to what we are now, where we are now. And so in a way, I like to say that the history of behavioral insights can be roughly divided into parts in these last 10 years. So we had at the very beginning, more or less 5 years in which pioneering behavioral insights units in government really delivered on big wins. And I'm sure you're familiar with this, but I'm talking about the use of social norms, for example, in several policy areas, starting with tax compliance. So in the UK, Guatemala, Mexico, and other areas, really the use of social norms for tax compliance revealed to be very useful. It was the same for reducing energy consumption. So having your energy use compared to your neighbors can reduce your energy use. And this kind of social norms or last mile interventions in which you change slightly one sentence in one letter can really be very useful as well to change the behavior, not only of citizens in general, but also to have very targeted interventions, such as with medical doctors. So this is another big win, and that has been replicated in many countries, like the UK, Australia, and New Zealand, in which you can change the behavior and the prescription rate of doctors to reduce antimicrobial resistance, always using social norms. And then I like to say that there's a second phase in the history of behavior, the short history of behavioral science. So starting from 2016, more or less, in which we slightly moved from applying behavioral insights only in the implementation phase. So really the last mile application of changing or having small tweaks in policies or communications. But also in recent years, we moved into having an impact also earlier in the policy cycle, when actually policymakers are drafting new rules, they are designing new policies and regulations. And this led to have more what we call BI-informed policy tools. So moving from a systematic use of behavioral science in public policy to a more systemic use of BI. So let me give you a couple of examples of this to make this more clear. So I'm thinking about BI-informed regulations, such as the new regulations on efficiency labels in the European Union, but also BI-informed taxes or financial disincentives. And a good example of this is the sugar tax in the UK that was informed by behavioral science. Equally important, most recently with government response to the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of the decisions of governments have been informed by evidence coming from behavioral science. Now we are in 2020, at the end of the 2021, and a lot of things have been done, but and there's a lot of new books and new things, including Nudge, the final edition, really trying to look back at what happened in these 10 years. But I'm very keen now to more focus on the present and the future of what's happening in the behavioral insights community right now. So as for the OECD has been fostering the BI community since at least 2014. You might be familiar with this, but there was a publication in 2017 with hundreds of case studies from around the world. And in 2018, there was the publication of the first map with different institutions applying behavioral insights to public policy around the world. And so this has been done much before I joined the OECD. Let's say there are some very important milestones that have been achieved by the OECD, including the publication of the Basic Toolkit in 2019, which is basically a sort of framework to apply behavioral science to public policy for policymakers, really from A to Z. And most recently in 2021, we really accelerated the work with the BI network. And now we have an official OECD Global Behavioural Insights Network. And I will tell you a little bit more about this in a minute. What we did at the very beginning of the year is that we started by running a survey trying to understand what's the current situation of BI units and BI practitioners around the world. And with did this in collaboration with BIOrg. So we designed together a survey and we collected data collecting data from more than 100 BI teams in 50 countries. And I don't want to go too much into the details, but one thing that it was interesting to discover is that of this sample, 50% of the BI units were created in the last 3 years only. So you can see in this graph showing here is that what's happening is that we have more and more BI practitioners in and outside government around the world. And so we did a series of expert meetings involving more than 100 BI experts from governments coming from more than 40 countries. And we had Dilip as well joining us for the first meeting in January. And the nice thing about this engagement is that we had a lot of community-led discussion during this year on really common challenges and needs from BI practitioners in government. And these consultations really, with the BI community, especially in government, informed our vision, mission, role, and objectives for the work on behavioral insights at the OECD. So this is, in one single slide, a little bit of our work. And I will give you examples and I will try to explain a little bit more about all these three things in a minute. But as an overview, basically we have three main roles as our BI team. So we have a role as convener, a role as enabler, and a role as partner. So let me start with the first one, the convener role. So I told you a little bit about this, and so it's really our work in fostering a global BI network of experts, practitioners, and policymakers applying BI to public policy. And this means a lot of work in knowledge aggregation, but also sharing, dissemination of case studies, organizing a lot of events, meetups, expert meetings, and symposia, but also doing a little bit of more the granular work with expert peers matching. So trying to see who in the world is working on specific policy challenges and connected them with other people across other governments or jurisdictions working on similar things. The second part of our work, it's our role as enablers, in which really we focus on developing tools and standards to enable the use and the integration of behavioral science to public policy. And in this bucket of work, we have the global frameworks that we develop. So the basic framework being one, and OECD standards, guidelines, and toolkit, but also support with capacity building on behavioral insights, and also technical support to set up new IBI functions within public governance systems. Now, to make this a little bit less abstract, I would like to give you a couple of examples. And so I will tell you about the three new interactive online tools that we launched just a couple of months ago. So we have an interactive map with BI units, the online repository of BI projects, and the BI Preregistration portal hosted by the OECD. So let me start with the first one, so the online map of BI units. So this came from the realization that map in 2018 was actually very much outdated because, as I told you at the very beginning, there are so many new practitioners and so many behavioral insights units almost every month, and that it's difficult to keep up the pace of the community with just a static map. And so actually Dilip had the great idea, Dilip from there, had a great idea of a living document. So a map showing different BI practitioners, but they could be updated over time. And so in the second part of 2021, we focused our attention into developing this. And this is what we did. So now it's up and running online, so you can have a look and visit it. And so every dot is one BI Behavioural Insights unit. And the nice thing about this is that the size, so basically you can click on every unit and you will have more details about the unit. So the number of projects that they uploaded, and as well as the team size and the policy areas that they're working on. So for example, here. And we try to embed a little bit of a nudge in this, in the sense that the size of every circle for every unit is directly proportional to the number of projects that every unit has uploaded in our system. And this is really to try and encourage people to share their results or their ongoing project. And for this, I really wanted to thank all the great people that have been involved at different stages to build up this interactive map. It's actually a lot of work, especially Bing and Cindy in Dilip's team, who at the very beginning of the year helped us with the design of the initial survey, together with Jan in my team, and also gave the idea of this interactive map. So special thanks to all these folks. Now we also wanted to not only to showcase how many and who were the BI practitioners in the community, but we also wanted to accelerate knowledge sharing. And so we created another map in which this time we showcase all the different projects that are linked to every BI units. So you can see here every project is adopt. And you can also filter. So even if you're not an expert in Behavioral Insights, which is primarily our target here for this map, you can filter projects accordingly to the methodology and policy areas, but also topic and behavioral tool. So you can really explore a wide range of case studies. And the nice thing about these tools is that we received quite a lot of support. So they have been launched less than 2 months ago. And we have gathered already 159 BI units representing more than 40 countries from all around the world. And we receive new projects every day, which is really exciting. Now, maybe you've noticed that there are 2 types of dots on our map, white dots and more yellow dots. And that's because we allowed people to upload projects that are completed, but also projects that are still ongoing. So we are big champions of pre-registering projects. So that's the next tool that I wanted to tell you a little bit more about, which is the pre-registration portal that we developed. So in a nutshell, you can go and visit it, but pre-registration, maybe you're familiar with it, is a very it's quite well known especially in the open science community. So it's basically just uploading and sharing the methods, the analysis plan, and all the details of your projects and study before actually starting to collect data. And we wanted to come up with a dedicated registry to pre-register and publish all projects, so not only experimental projects. And this, we wanted a mechanism basically to set standards for openness and rigor. And also it's good because you are able to discover projects early on, not after months of field trials and publications. And for the rest of the community, it's great because it's a place to discover ongoing projects and navigate case studies with the connected infrastructure of the OECD. And so you might ask why there's already pre-registration portals around, but what we found and what people in the community told us is that the existing frameworks, the existing portals weren't really adapted to a use for government people. So we wanted something that would have been super short to fill in, in which we reduce mandatory information and we allow admitting uncertainty as long as you can justify it after. And also we wanted to provide options to embargo sensitive information. So we are dealing with case studies from government mainly and on public policy. So sometimes you can have sensitive information that you don't want to share straight away while you're running the RCT, for example. And as part of our work on standards and best practices, we are also continuing the work started with BASIC. So right now we are focusing a lot of work on a practical guide for ethical application of BI in public policy. So what are the benefits for the BI community member for all this work? Well, we hope that this will give access to an engaged community of behavioral science practitioners, and that this will enable more real-time sharing of case studies of BI applied to very practical public policy challenges. And we wanted to create a space to grow ideas with other peers and accelerate learning and develop really standards of practice, but also a space to find resources, events, webinars, and reports, and ultimately to facilitate collaboration. So we really, with this work, we wanted to advance knowledge sharing and best practices, but also really serve as an example of how BI experts around the world can work together to respond to global challenges that several governments are facing. And so actually, this is a good segue to now the third part of our work, which is our support to governments. And I would like to give you a couple of examples. So in this bucket of work, we basically provide expert support to governments to apply behavioral science both to domestic and global policy challenges. In practice, this means help with policy development informed by behavioral science, support with diagnostic analysis, pilot design and scaling, and impact evaluation. And also a big focus that we have is on cross-border experiments. And the BI team at the OECD started collaborations across government in various policy areas. So in 2021, we worked on mental health, green governing, public communications, especially related to COVID-19, disinformation and misinformation, behavioral science has applied to changing the behavior of people working in the public administration, and also the future of work. For the sake of giving you an example, I will focus on a collaboration we had on disinformation and misinformation. So this one is one of my favorite projects of the year, for sure. And it was important because misinformation is a big priority for the OECD. So we all know that the spread of misinformation is posing very serious challenges in several governments, in several places around the world, because it really represents a threat for the future of democracy. And we know that there is still limited regulation on fake news. And on the other hand, we have increasing algorithm complexity and algorithm determinism. And really, democratic institutions could be eroded by the spread of misinformation, both online, but also via more traditional media. And so this is why combating and kind of tackling the problem of misinformation is so important, and it's a big priority for a lot of governments right now. So as for behavioral science, we noticed that the academic literature and the academic focus on misinformation is quite active, it's quite prolific. But governments are mainly focusing on more traditional intervention types, thinking about heavy regulations specifically on content and education as well. And in general, I would say that governments are only giving limited considerations to solutions that are informed by evidence from behavioral science. And so we've partnered with BI experts in the Canadian Impact and Innovation Unit and the French BI team to really join forces and develop behavioral science evidence to then guide government responses to misinformation. And so this was really the first cross-border collaborations of its kind. And because we recognize that the challenge of misinformation itself is intrinsically cross-national by definition. Disinformation and misinformation, they don't really know any borders. And this is why we really need a global policy solutions on this. So we work in partnership with the government of Canada and the government of France. And we basically use this framework that we came up with, which is called FACTS. So it's very similar to other frameworks, but it's more specific to misinformation if you want. So it's about targeting specific behaviors linked to misinformation, for example, sharing fake news on social media. It's about analyzing barriers and enablers of behaviors, then creating and co-design solutions, testing them to measure impact, and then finally scale them up. And so BIOrg in the Impact and Innovation Unit in the Government of Canada conducted this first study in the context of their Cosmos longitudinal survey. And this was a randomized controlled trial in which we had a sample of more than 1,000 Canadians to really test the impact of two different prompts on participants' intentions to share true and false news related to COVID-19. So based on some recent literature, especially a study published in 2020 by Pennycook and colleague, we had an hypothesis about the fact that prompting people with timely accuracy prompts and also media literacy tips will reduce the intentions to share false information online. So this was the study design. Basically, people after viewing different treatment conditions, that I will explain you in a second, then they will see, they were presented with 14 COVID-19 headlines, news headlines. 7 of them were true and 7 of them were false. And after that, they will basically the main outcome variables. So the questions that the study asked was, if you were to see the above article online, how likely would you be to share it? So that was the main outcome variable. And so this is just to explain you a little bit about the treatments, simplifying a little bit. So the first one was an accuracy evaluation treatment. So really an accuracy prompt in which we ask respondents to rate the accuracy of a headline which was actually unrelated to COVID-19. So this is really much similar to what Pennycook and colleague did in their Nature paper in 2020. And the second prompt, which we call media literacy tips, provided a list of 5 main media literacy tips aimed at stopping the spread of fake news online. And we collected exactly the same outcome variable after. So the data analysis is still ongoing. So all this is absolutely preliminary, but I wanted to share with you 3 main takeaways from the preliminary results. First, that the intention to share news was in this data was dissociated from the ability to detect if the news was true or false. So in practice, we found a disconnect between what people believe to be accurate and what actually people choose to share. This is no news, actually. It really corroborates what's the literature. And it just means that actually people are sharing things that maybe they don't believe in. So there's a dissociation between what people believe in and what people share. And then the other thing is that we replicated the effect in Pennycook and colleagues. So we found, and here it's the figure. So in this study, there was a replication of the effect of the accuracy prompt. So you can see, and this is the blue dot here, that if you raise the participants' attentions to accuracy, you increase the quality of the information shared. You can see here. And last thing that we found was that prompting participants with a list of media literacy tips, so this is the treatment here you can see in orange, was actually the most effective measures to reduce the intentions to share false information online. And you can see this very well for false news here. So they are preliminary results, but they are quite exciting because it's both a replication, but also a new results that further actually have even a further impact on sharing intentions of people. So now, what does it mean? I would say that this group demonstrated that some quick and scalable interventions can actually shift people's intention to share misinformation. And also that these results could call for a deeper considerations into policy, solutions, and initiatives, such as online prompts that still preserves and prioritize the autonomy of users when they're navigating the online world. And I would say that, coupled with other policy responses, such a bottom-up approach that really can try to ask people to be empowered and informed may be more effective than a regulatory approach alone, in which you try to shut down all the fake news in the world, which is actually very difficult. And the last thing, of course, is that experimental replication in other countries is super important to really better understand what works for whom and in what context, as well as trying to understand what are the lasting effects of these results. So is it something that will actually be able to replicate in a real world situation? And if it's something that it's a one-off, but it's something that has an effect over time. So this work was the result of really a beautiful partnership across different time zones and different institutions. And I would like to thank Dr. Lauren Conway and all her team in the Impact and Innovation Unit, who really saw the potential of this and found the time to run this experiment as part of their Cosmo longitudinal survey, even amongst all the different engagements of a government team in the middle of a pandemic. So thanks so much to Lauren, Brian, Alyssa, Andra, and Nick. And I would also like to thank Mariam, Dr. Mariam Chamat in the French BI unit, who really jumped on board and contributed to this international partnership. Now, I hope that I gave you a little bit of an appetizer of the kind of work that we have been doing in this last year, but please don't hesitate, of course, to ask any questions, and I hope we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A. So now I wanted to close with some final thoughts and wishes more for the future of the international behavioral insights community. So I'd like to say that we would like the future of the BI community to be global, in the sense that we would like to see more international collaborations across jurisdictions to better understand what works for whom and in what context. And these should include not only Western countries as usual, but really should include practitioners, experts from the Global South as well. We would also like the future of the BI community to be better integrated. So we would like to see more efforts to integrate and scale results from experiments in policy design and really try to go beyond last mile solutions. What I told you at the very beginning about trying to embed behavioral insights earlier in the policy cycle, it's something that we'd really like to see in the future. And we'd also like the future of the BI community to be sustainable. And we think that it's important to institutionalize BI capability to really ensure a sustainable application across governments. And finally, some wishes for this 2022. So more wishful thinking if you want. But I would like to see more examples of efforts to move all this work for systematic changes with isolated experiments into more systemic change, really embracing all the variety of tools in public governance. I would like to see more sharing of resources and standards, and definitely at the OECD we will do that. I would like to see more scaling of what works and adaptation to different contexts. It will be great as well to try and have more of a focus on diagnosing problems. Sometimes I feel that as behavioral scientists, we tend to jump straight into solution mode, and there's an untapped potential into our skills to really understanding what the policy problem is, thanks to behavioral science. I would also like to work more on what we call nudge the nudgers. So on changing the behaviors of policymakers and potentially politicians. So really coming up with a good framework for behavioral public administration. And lastly, I think it would be great if 2022 will bring us more what some people call mega studies across countries, especially on global challenges, such as, for example, misinformation, but there are so many other challenges that are waiting us, including climate change and many others. And on this note, I would like to thanks everybody for the attention, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your questions and having a discussion. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Chiara. We have a few questions for you. Starting off, Mariana had a question about how the OECD thinks about choosing different policy areas and projects. And I'll maybe just add to that, Fox News once described Cass Sunstein as the most dangerous man in America. And despite trying to be very careful about which projects you chose, this stuff can get very political very quickly. And I wonder, how does the OECD think about navigating those waters and choosing where to direct their efforts? Which types of projects do you choose, and do you have kind of a framework for how you decide?
Okay, the short answer, thanks, Mariana, for the question. So the short answer is that I don't think we have any systematic way of doing things in terms of choosing activities and projects at the OECD, at least. I know that other units around the world, actually, they have good ways of deciding things. To me, I think that at least for the OECD, policy priorities should be something that are of global interest. So as you say, health and climate is being number one. But more broadly, I think that any BI experts working in government or outside of government, but on public policy, should use some set of criteria to decide what to focus on. And these things are mainly, these criteria should be mainly, is this even relevant for a BI approach? Like a behavioral science approach could be good for a lot of different things, but sometimes you have much better approaches. And, sometimes I've been in a position to advise governments to say, well, actually, in this case, just do a traditional regulation, quick and dirty, and just forget about any evidence from behavioral science because it's not that relevant in that. So I really think that, again, coming back to the point of diagnosing the problem, I think we should get better at diagnosing policy challenges and problems to make sure that behavioral science is actually the right answer. And so hopefully this will help units, including the OECD, to choose the right policy priorities and the right projects.
Yeah, I think that's nice. There was an article that George Lowenstein wrote once that was kind of saying, sometimes behavioral scientists want to apply our toolkit to everything. And sometimes, you do need more traditional policy. Sometimes taxes and subsidies and things like that are the direction to go. So we shouldn't get overzealous with thinking that a more subtle nudge is always the right direction to go.
And as well, if I can just complete this, Colleen, I totally agree, but also we shouldn't forget that there's a lot of traditional policy tools that are actually informed by behavioral science. So it's not, I think that the toolbox of policy solutions is very much nuanced. So it's definitely not either we have nudges on one side or traditional policy tools on the other side. It's a spectrum of policy intervention and solutions, but it's not a dichotomy at all.
Oh, interesting. Okay, maybe I'll just ask one little follow-up there. So, if you take the Thaler-Sunstein definition of a nudge, they would say that it can't involve any kind of like big time or financial costs. Otherwise, it doesn't count as a nudge. But do you see it more as a spectrum between what counts as a nudge versus what counts as, a shove or a more traditional policy approach?
So I'm not a big fan of trying to get definition of everything because I feel that it's extremely different. But I hope that with the presentation, I make clear that I really think that, the timeline that I showed at the very beginning, you had nudges at the very beginning, and there will always be nudges in the wild, and they're a great thing. But also more and more people working in governments, they are trying to get inspiration and getting evidence from behavioral science to tweak traditional tools So the example of the UK sugar tax, so you can decide like different ways of presenting the same incentives, change the time at which you are delivering a regulation. All these kind of things are informed by behavioral science, but they are not nudges themselves, as at least in the in the ideal definition of a nudge. So the answer is yes. I think that they're not mutually exclusive, nudges and taxations, financial disincentives, regulation, and information.
That's great. Tim Dirksen has a question.
Yes.
He was asking, it seems like the majority of these interventions that have been done so far across a lot of these BI units around the world are targeted at individuals, but they're enacted through organizations and communities. And how does the OECD and partners think about research on group or organization behavior? Think of small businesses or charities or things like that. How much, or do you think of that as a area that the OECD is focused on?
So the short answer is definitely a big area of focus. And my colleague James Drummond, who's working at the OECD on behavioral science, is actually leading the way in terms of trying to think laterally on how to change the behaviors of mainly policymakers across different public institutions. So really driving organizational change, but also changing the processes themselves. So organizational behavior, it's a loose term in which you can think about changing the behaviors of groups of people for sure, but also changing ways of doing things, ways of working together. And this is very much in my wishes for 2022 about behavioral public administration. So nudging the nudgers is really that wish of, well, we can actually potentially maximize the impact that we have if we started and we prioritize changing the behavior of groups of people and groups of people that actually are nudging other peoples, such as policymakers. So very much a big focus. And there's a very nice paper that was just published by James, my colleague James, in November, a couple of weeks ago, that it's exactly about this, mainly focusing on regulators. So how to change the behaviors of regulators and the processes in regulatory reform. So have a look at that. I can share the link in the chat.
Great, thanks. So Sheng Wen had a question. Just curious about the difference between the study you mentioned on misinformation. Interested in why one worked. Oh, sorry, Chiara.
Sorry. Bonsoir, madame. Est-ce que vous pourrez passer à un autre moment pour travailler ou en fait, j'ai pu nettoyer moi-même, je suis en train de faire une présentation. Je vous remercie. Merci beaucoup. Bonsoir. Sorry.
No problem.
I'm in the office. It's late in the evening.
Yes, thanks for staying late with us here. We were curious about the difference between the two interventions in the misinformation study, and kind of more broadly there. So, you've got a RCT, you're going to be able to look at which one works better, but as social scientists, we're interested in why often. Hard to say. When you think about that, how do you think about following up on mechanism? Do you want to bring academics into that to kind of try to dig into the details of why one worked, or do you not care so much? You say, hey, we just want to learn what works.
I actually care a lot, of course. So that's a great question in the sense that very often you go so quickly when you work in government that you just find what works best and you just apply it, and that's all. So without really caring so much about the lasting effect, but also about the mechanisms themselves. So about why is it the case that in this study, and again, there are not final results, but why would be the case that giving people literacy tips, so giving people more information, works better compared to just an accuracy prompt that in the literature seems to work so well? Well, we don't know, because we don't have with RCTs like this, quick and dirty, you don't have the opportunity to really understand why. My background is in neuroscience, in neuroeconomics. And so one thing that I would really love to do, potentially we will do it with other academics, is to try and understand if there's any difference in our brain when you have different effects like this. Is it the case, for example, in the misinformation study, that the reason why giving media literacy tips works better compared to just an accuracy prompt Is it because just people were, attentive enough and giving more information about the why and explaining why it's important to be literate in social media? Is it because there's something in the brain going on that's different? Well, we don't know, but it will be really great to understand this. And I think, putting together the sustainability of effects together with the mechanism, it will be super important. So another wish for the 2022 will be to collaborate more as well with neuroscientists, for example, to try and understand the why of why sometimes you have different effects like this.
Switching gears a little bit, Daryl Salama was interested in how some of these behavioral insights groups might use kind of our toolkit combined with machine learning or artificial intelligence. Some groups and you think of tech companies have sometimes used AI and machine learning for hypothesis generation, and then behavioral insights teams can follow up with hypothesis testing. How do you think about how governments might use machine learning or AI in conjunction with behavioral insights approaches?
In a way, some governments are already doing this quite heavily. So I would say that one of the many ways in which you can use machine learning and algorithms, so AI, is really to try and tweak the type of interventions or the time at which you give the intervention. So in my opinion, at least in my experience on this, it's very useful to do it before the design phase. So really to have a look at which people are behaving in a certain way in your sample, so that then you can tweak the intervention slightly to be more adapted to particularly targeted groups. And this is something that it's virtually impossible to do, like without a massive amount of data and without a good and smart use of algorithms. So that's when I think it's the most useful use. But also the other thing is closing the feedback loop once you have accumulated a lot of knowledge, like the one we're accumulating at the OECD, how you can make sure that you can then do meta-analyses that are, instead of being done by a human brain, which is quite slow, how can you make sure that you can take all that knowledge and extracting data using, for example, machine learning to then inform future BI interventions?
Right. I've got my own question for you. You mentioned the BI projects repository, which sounds like a really, really useful resource and desperately needed. Of course, academia has a big file drawer problem, publication bias, right? For folks in the audience, right? If we don't get a result that we think is interesting, we throw it in the file drawer, never to be seen again. And pre-registrations are great for addressing things like p-hacking or harking, hypothesizing after the results are known, but they're not great for addressing the file drawer effect, right? You can pre-register all the studies you want, but if you don't end up following up and publishing or including the results of a null, doesn't help with the file drawer. Sounds like you guys are addressing that. So have you found a lot of activity of people, even if the result was unsuccessful, they're still uploading their project? And how can you encourage kind of a really good, useful repository of projects, including all the nulls, which, in academia, we're often not so good at that?
So I think that in a way, hopefully, pre-registering will prompt people to follow up even on null or negative results. As you can imagine, we are really trying to push hard on sharing the fact that you're doing an experiment or like whatever study you're doing before collecting data. And so in a way, we hope that, well, definitely we will follow up with people to ask them, well, what's happening on these?
Oh, you give them a poke or a nudge to say, hey, you pre-registered this. What happened?
I think so. But then, out of, let's be realistic, our portal, it doesn't, we can't have a look at everything that is happening. So it's more a system that we're trying to put in place. But in general, I think that pre-registering on the OECD portal or anywhere else, it's a good way to try and prompt people to then share null results. That said, we are also kind of trying to push really hard into providing standards related to ethics, but not only. And one of the standards that we're pushing massively on is what the behavioral economics team called the publish by default thing. So there are some units, so the units I worked in for the federal government in Australia, we publish it, all the reports, even our results, negative results, everything was publicly available on the website. And, like not a lot of teams do this, but if more people could do that, that would be great for academia and policymakers alike.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously we know as good social scientists that that's the direction to go, but you can see the incentives being tough for a BI unit at a government, especially if there was a deleterious effect, for instance. They might be reluctant to do that, but it sounds like in Australia, there's just a really good default. We always publish transparency. Do you think that's improving around the world as well?
I would say so. I think once you start, you can't stop. So if you have really a policy, like you start once, the first time it's very hard because the first time you have especially a negative result. So you're spending public money and you're telling, the government that your interventions are actually having a negative results on policy objectives. So that's particularly harsh. Now results are more likely than negative results. So, but still, it's difficult to defend the fact that you are spending time and money, public money, into something that is not delivering anything. But at the same time, I think that more and more people are doing it. And when big organizations like the OECD and other big conveners give these sort of big messages to the community, I hope there is something that can help and empower more people working in governments and academia to do the same.
Another question I had for you was thinking about how these RCTs and behavioral insights projects relate to cost-benefit analyses. So, a lot of governments, this is baked into the way they've been doing things for decades, is before you implement any new policy, they have a whole team there that does cost-benefit analyses. And that's kind of like a common way of doing things. However, as social scientists, we would say, a lot of the times the cost-benefit analysis are not using great data. You don't really have a good control group. If you saw, I guess here I'm thinking about ways to convince more governments to run an RCT. And I wonder, do you think, how can we make RCTs kind of more of a standard part of the way that these government units might think about cost-benefit analysis? And have you thought about trying to weave those together a little bit to say, hey, if you're doing a real cost-benefit analysis, you should probably be running an RCT of some sort?
So this is really, thank you so much for the question. This is really an important one. And I think that has been part of the strategy of BI units from the very early days. When you think about the very first nudge unit, so the UK Behavioural Insights Team, and I was fortunate enough to work there in London. And when they started off, they had a commitment to give a return on investment, I think of 3 to 1, and they deliver much more. And the fact, as you say, is that with Behavioural Insights and RCTs, you have a nice way to actually be able to show real cost-value fit analysis and return on investment. So historically, since then, like since 2013 or something, this has been used as a way to convince governments to fund and believe into Behavioural Insights units. So a lot of units around the world are actually using this as a way in. So saying, well, if you give me, $100 million, I will give you 10 times more. And it's something that you can actually show. The problem that I have with this, it's great. So I think it's a great way to convince policymakers into this. I see some issues about this, about the fact that, as usual, then you can overlook some very interesting policy challenges that are not giving return on investment per se. Things on well-being, improvement in main social issues. So a lot of the social improvement that we can have, you can't really have a direct measure. So it would be great also to use RCTs to measure other things. So not only focusing on return on investments or financial returns. I think it's the way to go. Another wish for 2022.
Yeah, I like that. I like that. And we're running out of time here. I have one very quick question for you. So, I mean, the OECD typically is working with federal government nudge units, right? But how much do you think of trying to get more municipal governments? And, you know, I think especially with cities, sometimes they're the ones closest to make some of the changes we'd like to be able to test. How does the OECD think about going down to the municipal level?
So the OECD is actually kind of working virtually with any public administration in the world at any level, federal, state, local, municipal. So, you know, there's no, of course, our main stakeholders are governments, so the head of governments, but also we have exchanges with all levels of governments. I totally agree with you when you say that behavioral insights can be super useful, especially for service deliveries and kind of things that are more the responsibility of local governments or municipalities. But I'm also a big believer about the fact that it's really good when, for example, in a country like Canada, you have multiple levels of governments really trying to use BI in a relevant way for their own work and for their own priorities. So having a center of government federal unit really leading the way, but also a plethora of other units in different parts of government that can really work together as well to make sure that BI is used in the best way possible.
Perfect. Yeah. Well, we're kind of bumping up against our time limit here, so just wanted to thank Chiara. Thank you for leading the webinar today. The full recording can be found on our BIOrg website under the events tab. Our next webinar is going to be on January 22nd, where we'll hear from the Behavioural Insights Unit in Victoria, Australia. And I just want to say thanks everybody for attending, and you can exit just by closing your Zoom screen. But thanks again to Chiara.
Thanks so much, Colin, and thanks everybody for joining us. Speak soon.